Hello, everyone. This is Professor Del Russo of Montclair State University's Child Advocacy Program. Welcome to our podcast on forensic interviews of children who have developmental disabilities. Today I have a very special guest with me. It's Russo-Heath Wallace, a licensed clinical social worker, a friend and a colleague. Rachel attended New York University School of Social Work, where she graduated in May 1987. She did her undergraduate studies at Stockton College and is also an adjunct professor at Montclair State University. Some of the students in this program have had Rachel as a professor. Right now she does part-time counseling at the Center for Prevention and Counseling in Newton, New Jersey. But before that, Rachel was the executive director of Ginny's House, which is the Sussex County Children's Advocacy Center. She also was the project coordinator for the Finding Words project, and she also acted as a forensic interviewing specialist in her capacity there. And you have already heard about the Finding Words Child First protocol in this course, and Rachel was involved in that project as well. She also was a child interview specialist up in Minnesota at the Corner House facility. She was a child interview specialist with the Passaic County Prosecutor's Child Advocacy Center. She's also been involved in a number of other endeavors, and she works tirelessly on behalf of children and the developmentally disabled. How you doing, Rachel?
Very good, Joe. Thank you.
Listen, I want to talk to you about the article that you wrote for the American Prosecutors Research Institute back in 2006. It was a two-part article on forensic interviews of children who have developmental disabilities. So, Rachel, children who have developmental disabilities, is there a different kind of approach towards interviewing them from the average child?
There is. Of course, with all kids, we apply that child-first doctrine, as we like to say, that we're looking at this particular child at this particular time, and we're not generalizing them just because of their age or their culture. We are looking specifically at this child's needs, and it's similar in that way, but there are a lot of different variables that you take into consideration when approaching an interview of a child who may have a developmental or cognitive disability.
I know that it's important in the Finding Words Child First protocol to gather information. That intake process is critical because, as you just stated, we need to speak to this particular child's abilities. And is there a similar process that you go through when you're interviewing a child who has DD?
Absolutely, and as we talk about with kids in general, we feel that the responsibility is really on the interviewer and, more importantly, on the team to conduct an effective interview rather than putting that responsibility on the child. You're doing a lot of the same information gathering prior to the interview, but in a nutshell, you're spending a lot more time in the information gathering process with a child who has a developmental disability in order to conduct an effective interview. We know that a lot of times in investigations there isn't a lot of time to spend gathering information. You don't have days. You certainly don't have weeks. We do think this is something that can be done in a short amount of time. Again, if you utilize the team and utilize certain resources in your community and people that are available to you simply by picking up the phone.
So what are the kinds of things that you would look for in the information gathering phase? Who do you want to talk to, and what kind of data do you want to get before you interview the child?
Obviously, a parent can be a great source of information in the information gathering stage regarding a child's ability or disability. However, there are times when you can't do that for obvious reasons if there's been an allegation against a parent. In addition, parents are sometimes still grieving their child's disability. It takes a long time to accept that their child might have limitations, that their child might not be typical, and because of that, they can be a biased source of information. They just see their kid. They might not see their kid interacting with other age mates. So parents can be a good resource, but we suggest the greatest resource is most likely somebody in the school. Kids typically spend most of their learning time in the school, and parents might have a lot of great information on their child, but not information about how the child might perform in an interviewing type setting. There's many resources at the school. Obviously, a child's teacher, but really kind of your golden ticket is the child's case manager on the child study team, someone that really understands this child's disability, but more importantly, how it manifests in the child's expressive and receptive language abilities.
The observation you make about parents that they can be good sources of information, however, sometimes they might be biased and often they're not the best source. That is really consistent with my experience as well. I often see parents either overrate or underrate sometimes their children's
Right.
abilities. And I guess that speaks to the fact that they're with them all the time and they're in a position to interpret their behavior and interpret their emotions, and they're more forgiving when it comes to their children's performances. Thus, sometimes they overrate.
Right. And they might not see a behavior as actually being something that is consistent with the child's disability because they're not around children who have Asperger's syndrome all day long. They just see their own child. So idiosyncratic behaviors that might mean nothing to them could be quite alarming to an interviewer. For example, a child that might rock as a soothing technique, or a child that might engage in echolalic speech patterns, which can really affect an interviewer and their ability to gather information. That could just be something a parent wouldn't think twice about if they saw their child doing.
You mentioned that the child's case manager or the person that's responsible for that child on the child study team, typically are these school personnel accessible? Can you get their records quickly in order to do a forensic interview?
You probably couldn't get an actual paper copy of their records quickly, and then we're talking about the small window of time that we have prior to an investigative interview. However, you should be able to speak verbally with that individual. Now, folks will have to check with the confidentiality laws, but typically individuals who are working as agents of the state in child protective services or in law enforcement are able to access that information under Title IX or simply because there's an investigation in process. But a conversation with the person on the phone could easily answer some of these questions. Specifically, many times children have a one-on-one aide that's assigned to them. They're typically paraprofessionals, so it's not necessarily someone that's going to use professional language and buzzwords about child's disability and their IQ, but it's someone that you can just ask, how do I know if they're understanding me? What seems to be helpful in getting this child to stay on task and to remain focused? The classroom aide will be an extreme source of information in terms of some of those questions.
And I guess since it is the child's information that you're trying to get from school or school personnel, the parent or caregiver can provide a waiver, and this obviates the need to protect the information on the basis of confidentiality, right?
Certainly.
Let's take a look at some of the things that you want to gather, what you want to know about the child from whoever your source of information is. What kinds of areas would you explore before that interview begins so that you can speak to that particular child's abilities?
Obviously, you're going to want to know what the child's primary disability is. Typically, if a child has an obvious developmental disability, they've been involved in the school child study team, there's an individualized education plan in place, and in order to do that, there's typically a diagnosis. Now, we don't want to get caught up in a diagnosis. It doesn't tell us necessarily about the specific child, and I really do hate labels, but you will be able to learn generally what this child's limitations might be in the communication process based on their primary disability. In addition, there are sometimes secondary diagnoses that go along with a primary diagnosis, which again will be helpful in the interview process. For example, a child who has Rett syndrome might also have some medical needs along with that, and that certainly is information that you'll want to be aware of. Physical needs of the particular child, it's really important to explore if your interview facility will be able to accommodate a child that might be in a wheelchair or a child that might have to use facilitated devices to walk. Something as small as arm crutches, but something as large as stretchers. There are children sometimes who actually are moved around on stretchers because of their inability to be mobile, and eventually in their life they learn how to perhaps use a wheelchair or use some other form of transportation, but until they can do that, some of the transportation devices can be bulky, and you want to make sure that you're going to be able to get that child in your interview facility. If a child wears glasses, obviously you'll want them to bring them at the time. Hearing aids, you'll want to make sure that the child is ready to participate 100% in the interview process. An important piece of information to find out, and typically school personnel will know this, and often a parent will know this as well, Is the child's cognitive or developmental age equivalent? Children who have been involved in the IEP process, again, the Individualized Education Plan process in school, will have had at least one, if not several, learning evaluations. And in this learning evaluation, they assign a cognitive age to a child. So you might have a child who's 11 years old but is functioning at the level of, say, a 5 or 6-year-old. Again, that's really helpful in knowing how to pose our questions to this particular child. And again, it's typically something that a parent will know. And primarily, developmental disabilities affect an individual's ability to communicate. It's one of the areas that's affected by the definition of a developmental disability. And obviously, that's really what we're looking to do in an investigative or forensic interview. So you want to find out about a child's expressive and receptive language abilities. Expressive is how the child communicates outwardly. Receptive is how they understand people. How does this child best communicate? Do they use boards or pictures to assist in their communication? Some kids who are hearing impaired might use sign language. You want to find out if it's American Sign Language, if it's idiosyncratic signs, if the child can read lips. This is all information that you'll want to find out beforehand. And something to remember is that kids typically do understand more than they're able to speak. A child's expressive abilities typically are less than their receptive abilities. So you might find that they understand you, but they're not necessarily able to verbalize that. And if there's a processing delay, there might be a long pause between the question you ask the child and the child's response.
Which I think takes us to the interview process itself. Now, you talked about a lot of information gathering and a lot of sources and a lot of things to be on the lookout for when you're going to interview a child who is developmentally disabled. What about during the interview itself? Is there a special challenge for an interviewer who is interviewing a developmentally disabled child?
There is. Most challenging is what we refer to as scatter skills. Children who have developmental disabilities have an unevenness in their disability and also in their ability to communicate. So you might see a child that seems to understand what you're talking about, but they can't actually answer the question. Or a child that has gained a lot of life experience and has language that goes along with that, but they're not necessarily understanding the questions that you're asking. That's a real challenge. And with all children, our developmental assessment happens throughout the interview, but the primary place for us to start to decide how we're going to pose our questions to a child and what their particular ability is during the rapport building process. So you really, really have to pay attention to the child, which can be a difficult thing to stay there with the child who has the disability during the rapport building stage.
Are developmentally disabled children prone to suggestibility?
There's been some research done. The short answer of that is, all kids are. And there's been some research done that Jennifer and I looked at. Prior to writing this article, we had a really, really complicated case, and it involved siblings who had extreme disabilities. And a lot of these questions came up for us, and one of them was the idea of source monitoring, if the child had actually experienced what she was talking about or if she had seen it or it had been imagined. So we looked at some research and we found, believe it or not, there was some actual research done on children's understanding of real versus imagined events. And they compared typical age children with their developmental age mates. If you remember before, Joe, I mentioned a child's cognitive age versus their actual age, and they used that idea in this research. This was done in 1994, and they compared children who were diagnosed with mental retardation to typical children. They matched their age equivalent scores, and what they did was there were 24 interactive activities. They would tell the kids, hold hands with each other, clap, sit down, walk backwards, and they would actually have the children do these activities, and then some of them they would tell the children to imagine they were engaging in these activities. They interviewed the kids immediately, and then there was a 6-week delay, and they included in the process of inquiry, as we refer to it in the Child First interview protocol, they included open-ended questions, specific, or as we call them, focus questions, and also misleading questions. And what they found was that there was really no difference in the children's ability to remember the actual experienced events better. All kids remembered what they experienced better. The children rarely mentioned the imagined activities when they were asked open-ended questions. And all kids performed better without delay. And that's not a lot different from what we know in the other research that is available to us. However, children with developmental disabilities did have more difficulty distinguishing real from imagined in general. So source monitoring can be an issue with children who have disabilities. What we can learn from this is what we know anyway, is that we really have to stick to those open-ended questions, and we have to be careful of more leading or focused questions with these children, particularly yes-no questions. This can really lead children who have developmental disabilities down the path of acquiescence. They tend to have a yes bias to questions that are asked of them. You have to remember, Joe, that these kids have been tested for most of their lives, and this is basically part of the evaluation process to assure that their learning needs are being met. But in this, they learn to acquiesce. They want to please the interviewer more so than perhaps a typical child, and you really need to avoid the yes-no questions if at all possible. And if you have to use it, we always know that we want to follow a focused question with an open-ended question.
So it seems to me like the rules for interviewing children and interviewing preschoolers are pretty much the same for interviewing developmentally disabled children, except you probably should follow the rules more strictly and more rigorously with this population.
Absolutely. And again, as I mentioned before with the scatter skills, a preschooler that you might ask a question to and who would respond yes wouldn't necessarily be able to follow up with an open-ended question such as, tell me more about that. I love to use that phrase, junk answer means junk question. If I'm not necessarily getting an answer that makes sense, I have to look at the question that I asked. And with a preschooler, that's going to be obvious. However, with a child that might be older and who has a developmental disability, they might say yes, and when you ask a follow-up question, they might be able to provide an answer that might seem legitimate and it might seem to make sense because that child has had greater life experiences than a preschooler. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. It makes a lot of sense. And thus, they present greater challenges than the average child. It's hard enough interviewing children. It is just another layer of difficulty when they have developmental disabilities.
Yes.
And I assume repeated questions are similarly problematic, and we need to be vigilant with regard to them as well.
Yeah, and again, it's the acquiescence, it's the need to please, and we know that if we ask a child a question more than once, they might think that they gave us the wrong answer. And kids who have developmental disabilities might not be able to do that self-monitoring in the interview that we sometimes ask kids to do, such as, if I ask you a question more than once, it's not because you didn't give me the right answer, it's because maybe I forgot. Things like that, a child with a disability, it's very helpful for us to give them those guidelines. For example, if you don't know the answer to a question I ask, it's okay to say, I don't know. But that child might have more difficulty actually using that guideline in the interview.
Well, listen, Rachel, it's been a real pleasure talking to you. I haven't talked to you in a long time, and it's an interesting context for us to reconnect after a little absence. But nevertheless, thank you for your time tonight. And
if I could just say one thing, Joe, it is don't give up on these kids. They need us more than ever. Some research shows that 90% of individuals who have developmental disabilities will be sexually abused over their lifetime. 90%. And these kids can be effective witnesses. They can be credible. And it's really up to us to bring that out in the child and to fight for them and not to give up.
Well, on that note, thank you, and good luck with your kids, and good luck with your practice.
Thanks, Joe.
Take care.
Bye.